They called them the Carter brothers, 6 men born in chains, bound by blood, and broken by a whip. On Beauregard plantation, their silence was survival. Until the youngest, Isaiah, was beaten for humming a Union song. That night, under a blood-red moon, his brothers swore an oath. They wouldn't die slaves, they'd die soldiers. Through swamp and gunfire, they fled north and joined the Union Army, trading iron shackles for iron rifles. In war, they became legends, the Carters of the Cross, men who carved their scars into enemy steel. But freedom came with a darker hunger, vengeance. Because their master, Silas Beauregard, still lived, rebuilding the same hell they escaped, and the brothers were coming home to finish what he started. Some say they fought for justice, others whisper they just wanted blood. But one truth burned through the smoke of war. When the fire rose again, not even God could tell the saints from the sinners. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The sun crawled over the horizon, painting the Louisiana sky in shades of orange and pink. On Beauregard plantation, 6 brothers already stood in the cane fields, bodies bent with work that had begun before dawn. Their shadows stretched long across the earth as they swung their blades through the thick stalks. Josiah Carter, the eldest at 34, kept his eyes on the ground and his back straight. His massive hands gripped the cutting tool with practiced ease. Beside him worked Eli, the second brother, whose lips moved in silent prayer with each swing of his blade. Moses, the third brother, attacked the cane with fury, as if each stalk had done him personal harm. Caleb, the craftsman, worked with quiet precision, while Abram kept glancing at the sky, measuring the day's heat to come. And then there was Isaiah, just 16, the youngest of the Carter brothers. As his blade sliced through the sugar cane, a soft melody escaped his lips. John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave. The tune was barely audible, just a whisper of defiance in the morning air. Isaiah's voice was low, but in the quiet dawn, sound carried. His soul is marching on. Isaiah didn't notice the overseer's head snap toward him, didn't see the man's face twist with rage. He only felt the sudden crack of a whip near his feet. "Boy, what you singing?" The overseer's voice cut through the field. Isaiah froze, knife mid-swing. His brothers stiffened, hands tightening on their tools. "Nothing, sir," Isaiah said, eyes dropping to the ground. "Liar!" The overseer grabbed Isaiah by his worn shirt. "That's Union trash! You singing Union trash on this plantation?" The other slaves in the field stopped working, watching with eyes that had seen this scene before. The Carter brothers exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them. Josiah gave a tiny shake of his head. Not now, not yet. As Moses half raised his blade, the overseer dragged Isaiah across the field toward the main house, where Silas Beauregard sat on horseback, surveying his kingdom. Beauregard was a tall man with a thick beard and cold eyes. His fine clothes were a stark contrast to the rags worn by the people he owned. "Mr. Beauregard, sir," the overseer called out. "Caught this one singing John Brown's song, the abolitionist tune." Beauregard dismounted slowly, his boots landing in the dirt with a soft thud. He approached Isaiah, who stood with head bowed but shoulders squared. "You mock our God-ordained order?" Beauregard's voice was soft, almost gentle, which made it all the more frightening. "You bring that northern poison onto my land." Isaiah said nothing. What could he say that wouldn't make things worse? Beauregard looked up, noticing the other Carter brothers had followed at a distance, watching. "Bring them all," he ordered. "They'll watch. They'll learn." The brothers were marched to the whipping post, a wooden structure stained dark with old blood. Other field hands were gathered too. A message sent with one body, received by many. 20 lashes, Beauregard announced, and you'll all count them. Isaiah was stripped to the waist and tied to the post. At 16, his back was already marked with scars, but fewer than his older brothers. That would change today. The overseer uncoiled his whip with a practiced flick. Crack! The first lash cut through the air and then through Isaiah's skin. He bit his lip to keep from crying out. 1, the gathered slaves murmured. Crack! 2. Eli's lips moved in prayer. Eyes closed against the sight. Caleb stared straight ahead, his face a mask. Abram counted under his breath, each number falling like a stone. Moses trembled with rage, and Josiah placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. Josiah's eyes never left Isaiah, sending strength through his gaze. Crack! By the 10th lash, Isaiah's back was a mess of torn flesh. By the 15th, his legs had buckled, and only the ropes kept him upright. By the 20th, his consciousness flickered like a candle in the wind. 20, came the final count. Beauregard nodded with satisfaction. Let this be a lesson, he said to the gathered slaves. There is only one song on this plantation, the song of work and obedience. As the crowd dispersed, the brothers were allowed to cut Isaiah down. They carried him back to the slave quarters as the day's work resumed. The sun was now high and merciless. That night, in the cramped cabin they shared with 4 other men, the brothers tended to Isaiah's wounds. Caleb cleaned the cuts with water stolen from the kitchen. Eli whispered prayers over his brother's broken skin. Abram stood guard by the door. Moses paced like a caged animal. This has to end, he muttered. Josiah sat beside Isaiah, his large hands clenched so tight his own palms bled where his nails dug in. He looked at each of his brothers in turn, his eyes settling finally on Isaiah's pain-twisted face. It will end, Josiah said, his voice low but firm. No man's whip will mark us again. Isaiah's eyes fluttered open. We can't fight them all, he whispered. We won't, Josiah replied. We'll leave. The word hung in the air like smoke. Leave. Escape. The thing whispered about, but rarely attempted, for the price of failure was worse than death. Later, when the plantation slept, the 6 brothers met behind the smokehouse. The moon hung heavy and red in the sky, casting everything in a bloody glow. Josiah pulled a small knife from his boot. Without hesitation, he drew the blade across his palm, letting the blood well up. By this blood, I swear to live free or die trying, he said, offering the knife to Eli. One by one, each brother cut his palm and repeated the oath. When the blade reached Isaiah, his hand trembled, but his voice was steady. They pressed their bleeding hands together, 6 wounds becoming 1. We will return one day, Josiah promised, as free men, and Silas Beauregard will answer for every scar he's put on our backs. Under the blood-red moon, they buried small bundles of stolen tools and food at the edge of the fields. Abram checked the position of the stars, calculating the best direction for their flight. Caleb had been secretly making small maps from scraps of paper. Moses had sharpened sticks into weapons. Eli had memorized safe hiding places he'd heard about from other slaves. Isaiah, who had learned to read in secret, had stolen a page from a northern newspaper that mentioned routes to freedom. As they returned to their cabin, an owl hooted from a nearby tree. The brothers exchanged looks. The owl's call again. 3 hoots. A pause. 2 more. Their sign. Tomorrow, when darkness fell again, they would begin their journey toward freedom or death. There would be no middle ground. The day crawled by with agonizing slowness. The brothers worked the fields as usual, their bodies moving through familiar motions while their minds raced ahead to nightfall. They exchanged glances, but few words. Even the youngest knew that today, silence was their shield. As dusk settled over Beauregard Plantation, the brothers gathered in their cramped cabin. Isaiah's back still burned from yesterday's whipping, but tonight there was no time for pain. Caleb knelt in the center of the dirt floor, his nimble fingers arranging small bundles. "Take only what you can run with," he whispered, handing each brother a cloth sack containing dried meat and cornbread stolen over many weeks. "If we get separated, head north by the stars like Abram showed us." Josiah nodded, tucking the food inside his shirt. "Remember, we stay together. We move fast and quiet." Abram slipped back inside the cabin, his eyes wide with alertness. "I checked the path to the swamp," he reported in a hushed tone. "2 guards by the south fence, but they're sharing a bottle. They'll be sleeping soon." Moses gripped a sharpened stick wrapped in cloth at one end, a makeshift weapon. "And if they ain't sleeping? Then we make them sleep," Eli said, surprising them all with his hardness. The second brother usually preached patience, but tonight his face showed only determination. A soft knock at the door made them freeze. Josiah moved first, easing it open just enough to see their sister Ruth's face in the dying light. At 28, Ruth worked in the main house, which gave her slightly more freedom of movement and access to information. "The master and his son are entertaining guests in the study," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "Now's the time." She pressed something into Josiah's hand, a small wooden crucifix on a leather cord. "Take this." It was Mama's. Josiah's throat tightened. Their mother had died 5 winters ago, worked to death in these same fields. "Come with us," he urged. Ruth shook her head. "They'd notice me gone too quick. I'll follow when I can." She touched his face gently. "Go before the dogs wake." With one last look at his sister, Josiah turned to his brothers. "It's time." One by one, they slipped out of the cabin and into the shadows. They moved between the slave quarters, past the smokehouse, toward the edge of the property, where the sugar-cane fields met the wild swamp beyond. Unknown to the brothers, a figure watched from the window of the main house. Edward Beauregard, the master's 26-year-old son, had noticed Ruth sneaking toward the slave quarters. Curiosity and jealousy had drawn him to follow her with his eyes. He'd seen enough to guess what was happening. Edward had always watched Ruth with hungry eyes, desiring what his father forbade him to touch. Now he saw an opportunity. Expose the escape, be the hero, and perhaps win his father's permission to have Ruth as his reward. With a smirk, he moved through the house to find his father. The brothers crept through the tall cane, using its cover to approach the tree line. Abram led the way, his knowledge of the land guiding them through the darkness. They had almost reached the swamp's edge when the night exploded with light. Torches flared to life around them, forming a semicircle of fire that blocked their path to freedom. Edward Beauregard stood at the center, flanked by overseers holding straining dogs on thick chains. "Going somewhere?" Edward called out, his voice thick with triumph. "Father will be very interested to know his property tried to leave without permission." Josiah pushed Isaiah behind him, scanning for an escape route. The dogs lunged and barked, pulling against their restraints. "You've got nowhere to run," one overseer shouted. "Come back peaceful, and maybe you'll live through the whipping." Moses gripped his sharpened stick. "We ain't going back," he growled. "Then you'll die here," Edward said with a shrug. He nodded to the men holding the dogs. "Release them." Josiah saw his chance in that moment, a desperate, dangerous chance. As the overseers bent to unchain the hounds, he lunged forward with startling speed. The knife he'd hidden in his boot flashed in the torchlight as he slashed not at the men, but at the dogs' chains. 3 hounds broke free before anyone could react. Trained to chase fleeing slaves, the animals were confused by the chaos. When Edward raised his arms and shouted, one dog turned on him, mistaking him for a threat. The air filled with screams as the hound's teeth sank into Edward's arm. The other dogs joined the attack, driven by pack instinct. "Run!" Josiah bellowed to his brothers. They scattered into the darkness as the overseers struggled to control the situation. Gunshots cracked through the night, bullets tearing through leaves and splashing into mud around them. The brothers ran, as they had never run before, plunging into the swamp where horses couldn't follow easily. They splashed through shallow water, their feet sinking into mud, pushing through reeds and ducking under hanging moss. "Keep moving," Josiah called back, counting his brothers as they fled. The sounds of pursuit echoed behind them. Shouts, dogs barking, the occasional gunshot. Hours seemed to pass as they pushed deeper into the swampland, guided only by the stars when they could see them through the cypress canopy. A sharp cry made Josiah turn. Abram stumbled, clutching his upper arm. "I'm hit," he gasped, but kept moving. "Just grazed me." "Don't stop." Blood seeped between his fingers, but the wound wasn't deep enough to slow him for long. The brothers continued their desperate flight, the sounds of pursuit gradually fading behind them. Finally, when their legs could carry them no further, they collapsed beneath the massive roots of a cypress tree. Water lapped at their ankles, and mosquitoes whined around their heads, but they had no strength left to move. Josiah counted again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All his brothers were there, breathing hard, covered in mud and sweat, but alive. In the far distance, a faint orange glow still marked the plantation. Whether it was torchlight from their pursuers, or something more, they couldn't tell. Josiah's eyes fixed on that distant light. "That's the first flame he won't control," he muttered, his voice rough with exhaustion. Abram tied a strip of cloth around his wounded arm. "How far do we need to go?" "As far as it takes," Josiah answered. "Rest now. We move again before dawn." The brothers huddled together in the darkness, their first taste of freedom mixed with the copper tang of blood and the bitter knowledge that Ruth remained behind. They were hungry, bleeding, and hunted, but they were no longer slaves. Deep in the Louisiana swamp, 6 brothers closed their eyes to rest, knowing that when they opened them again, they would continue their journey into the unknown night. Morning broke over the swamp in thin, watery streams of light that barely penetrated the thick canopy. The brothers woke from fitful sleep, their bodies stiff from spending the night huddled against cypress roots. The air hung heavy with moisture and the buzzing of insects. Josiah was the first to rise, scanning their surroundings. "We need to keep moving east," he said, his voice low. "Stay in the water when we can. Dogs can't track us there." They waded through murky water that sometimes reached their waists, sometimes only their ankles. The going was slow and treacherous. Hidden roots grabbed at their feet, and more than once Moses had to pull Abram from sinking mud. By midday, hunger gnawed at their bellies. They hadn't eaten since their escape 2 nights before. "Look here," Caleb called softly, pointing to a cluster of blackberries growing along a slightly drier patch. The brothers gathered around, picking the fruit with desperate fingers. "Not too many at once," Eli cautioned as Isaiah stuffed handfuls into his mouth. "Your stomach needs to get used to it." They foraged what they could find: blackberries, wild onions, even some cattail roots that Caleb showed them how to clean and eat. The food was barely enough to quiet their hunger, but it gave them strength to continue. Isaiah lagged behind as the day wore on. His back, still raw from the whipping, had begun to show angry red streaks spreading outward from the deepest cuts. When they stopped to rest, Josiah placed a hand on his youngest brother's forehead. "He's burning up," Josiah said, his face grim. Eli tore a strip from his already tattered shirt, soaked it in relatively clean water, and pressed it to Isaiah's forehead. "It's infection setting in," he murmured. "We need to find real help soon." They made a crude shelter of branches and moss where Isaiah could rest, while the others took turns watching and gathering what food they could find. Night fell, and the swamp came alive with new sounds: the deep rumble of bullfrogs, the occasional splash of something large moving through water, and, most worryingly, distant baying that might have been hunting dogs. By morning, Isaiah could barely stand. His eyes were glassy, his skin hot to the touch. Josiah and Moses took turns carrying him on their backs as they pushed forward. "We can't keep going like this," Abram said, on the third day, as they paused by a small stream to drink. "Isaiah needs medicine." As if in answer, a twig snapped somewhere to their right. All 5 able-bodied brothers tensed, reaching for sticks or stones, whatever might serve as a weapon. "Don't move," came a voice, and suddenly they were surrounded by men in blue uniforms, rifles pointed at them. "Union soldiers," Caleb whispered, half in fear, half in hope. A tall white man in a black coat stepped forward from behind the soldiers. He wore no uniform, but carried a Bible in one hand. His beard was neatly trimmed, his eyes sharp, but not unkind. "I am Reverend Harlan," he announced. "We mean you no harm if you're friends of the Union." His gaze traveled over their ragged clothes and lingered on Isaiah's limp form. "This boy needs medical attention." Josiah stood his ground, positioning himself between the strangers and his brothers. "My brother has fever. We escaped Beauregard Plantation 3 nights past." The Reverend's expression softened. "Then you are welcome among us. President Lincoln's proclamation has set you free, brothers." The soldiers lowered their rifles, and 2 men approached to help with Isaiah. Josiah reluctantly allowed them to take his brother, following close behind as they led the group through the woods. After half an hour's march, they reached a small clearing where a dozen tents stood in neat rows. A flag of the United States hung from a central pole. Around campfires sat men and women, some black, some white, talking or working on various tasks. "This is our sanctuary," Reverend Harlan explained, "a way station for those seeking freedom." Isaiah was taken to a medical tent, where an elderly woman applied poultices to his infected wounds and spooned broth into his mouth. The other brothers were given food, real food, beans and salt pork that made their mouths water, and clean water to wash with. That evening, as the camp gathered for prayers, Reverend Harlan stood before them all. "Brothers and sisters," he intoned, his voice carrying through the clearing, "remember that your freedom comes from God above, not the guns of men. Faith frees the soul. Fire only binds it anew." His sermon continued as the sun set, speaking of patience and forgiveness. Several of the escaped slaves nodded along, their faces peaceful. But Josiah noticed something else. None of the black men carried weapons, while the Union soldiers kept their rifles close. After the sermon, as the brothers settled in a tent provided for them, Josiah sat watching the camp through the open flap. "They feed us well," Eli said quietly. "Isaiah's fever is breaking already." "And they preach to us well," Josiah replied, his voice flat. "But look at who holds the rifles." Moses crawled closer, his eyes narrowing as he followed Josiah's gaze. "Still cages," he whispered. "Just bigger ones with nicer keepers." That night, as most of the camp slept, Josiah gathered his brothers close. Isaiah was propped up on blankets, his eyes clearer now, listening. "We thank them for their help," Josiah said softly. "But we don't stay to be their good example of grateful slaves. Tomorrow night, we take what we need and go." "Go where?" Caleb asked. "East, to join the real fight." Josiah's eyes reflected the dying firelight. "Not as followers, but as soldiers." The brothers nodded, understanding without needing more words. The next day passed in a show of gratitude. They attended prayers, accepted food, and listened to Reverend Harlan's plans to send them north to safety. All the while, they watched and waited. When the camp fell quiet that night, they moved like shadows. Moses and Josiah slipped into the supply tent, emerging with 6 rifles and ammunition. Caleb and Abram gathered food. Eli helped Isaiah dress in the warmest clothes they could find. Last, they entered the soldiers' tent, where spare uniforms were kept. 6 blue coats, 6 pairs of boots, 6 caps, all taken silently. Before the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky, The 6 brothers vanished into the forest. They left behind only a small wooden crucifix, Ruth's gift, placed carefully on Reverend Harlan's Bible. They marched east along a muddy road, rifles on their shoulders, wearing the blue of the Union Army. The sunrise stained the distant Mississippi River gold, lighting their path forward. "First time I've ever walked a road without looking over my shoulder," Abram said. Josiah nodded. The weight of the rifle on his back felt like nothing compared to the invisible chains they'd carried their whole lives. For the first time, they walked not as property, but as men with purpose. "We ain't free yet," Josiah said, "but now we got the means to earn it." 2 days later, the brothers reached a clearing where blue tents spread across a field like giant mushrooms. Men in Union uniforms moved about with purpose. Most striking to the brothers was the sight of black men in those same blue uniforms drilling in formation. "United States colored troops," Eli whispered, a hint of awe in his voice. Josiah squared his shoulders. "Remember our story. We're freedmen from New Orleans, came north to join the fight." They approached the camp, rifles carried carefully, not too confidently, but not like men who'd never held weapons before. A white officer with a thick mustache and captain's bars spotted them and frowned. "Halt!" he called. "State your business." Josiah stepped forward. "Sir, we're freedmen from New Orleans. We've come to enlist in the Union Army." The officer circled them slowly, eyeing their stolen uniforms. "6 brothers, all looking to fight? Where'd you get those coats?" "Traded for them, sir," Moses said quickly. "Heard we'd need blue to be recognized as soldiers, not runaways." The captain's eyes narrowed. "Papers?" The brothers exchanged glances. Isaiah, still weak but standing on his own, felt his heart pound against his ribs. "Lost them crossing the bayou, sir," Josiah said evenly. "But we can read and write." "Isaiah here was schooled by a missionary," the captain grunted. "Can you now, boy?" Isaiah swallowed hard. "Yes, sir," he said, remembering Ruth's secret lessons in the slave quarters, her finger tracing letters in dirt. "We'll see about that." The captain turned to a nearby sergeant. "Wilkins, find these men a tent. We'll sort them out tomorrow." The sergeant, a black man with graying temples, nodded. "Yes, Captain Monroe." As Captain Monroe walked away, Sergeant Wilkins lowered his voice. "He's not convinced, but we need every man we can get, especially since Milliken's Bend." "That where we're headed?" Josiah asked. "Soon enough." Wilkins led them through the camp. "You boys really from New Orleans?" "Does it matter?" Moses challenged. Wilkins gave a knowing smile. "Guess not. You're here now." Their tent was small for 6 men, but after sleeping in swamps and slave quarters, it felt like luxury. That night, Isaiah whispered, "Do you think they believe us?" "They believe we can hold rifles and take bullets," Josiah replied. "That's all that matters right now." The next morning began with a harsh awakening. Captain Monroe stood over them at dawn, shouting for them to fall in. The brothers were handed proper uniforms and equipment, then thrust into training with 24 other new recruits. "Faster!" Monroe barked as they struggled to load their rifles in unison. "The Rebs won't wait for you to fumble with your powder." Isaiah's hands trembled. His back still hurt from the whipping, and the fever had left him weak. Twice he dropped his ramrod. The second time, Monroe stormed over. "You're slowing everyone down, boy." Josiah tensed, ready to intervene, but Isaiah straightened. "I'll do better, sir." "You'd better," Monroe growled, "or you'll be digging latrines instead of fighting." By midday, Isaiah's arms burned from the weight of the rifle and the endless drills. Yet something had changed in him. For the first time, he held a weapon that wasn't a farm tool. No one could take it from him or punish him for touching it. Despite his exhaustion, pride swelled in his chest. Over the next few days, the brothers settled into military life. They learned to march in formation, to fire on command, to set up camp and break it down efficiently. White officers were harsh, but the black sergeants and corporals showed patience, offering quiet tips when officers weren't watching. Josiah's natural leadership quickly earned notice. During a drill where they practiced holding the line against a simulated charge, it was Josiah who steadied the men when others faltered. "Eyes forward," he'd called. "Stand firm." After the drill, Sergeant Wilkins pulled him aside. "You've led men before." It wasn't a question, but Josiah answered anyway. "My brothers, that's all." "Well, you've got a gift for it. Keep it up." As the brothers trained, they found unity again. The shared purpose, learning to fight, preparing for battle, bound them together as tightly as their escape had. Each night, they gathered in their tent, comparing what they'd learned, helping each other improve. One evening, Moses unwrapped a small package from his knapsack. Inside was a knife he'd bartered for with extra rations. "What's that for?" Caleb asked. Moses turned the knife in his hand, the blade catching the lantern light. "A mark. So they know who we are when they find us." "Find us?" Eli frowned. "Dead or alive," Moses said flatly. "Everyone needs a mark in war." He took his rifle and began carving a small cross into the wooden stock. Not a Christian cross, but the X-shape of the Beauregard plantation brand that had been burned into their backs as boys. "The Carters of the Cross," Moses said, his voice low. "That's who we are now." One by one, the brothers did the same. When it came to Isaiah's turn, his hands still shook, but the mark he carved was clear and deep. The regiment received orders 3 days later. They would join the fight near Milliken's Bend on the Mississippi River, where Confederate forces were pressing hard against Union lines. "We march at dawn," Sergeant Wilkins announced. "Check your equipment and get rest." That night, the brothers sat around a small campfire just outside their tent. The mood in camp was tense. Men writing letters home, checking weapons, praying quietly. But the Carter brothers were calm, each finishing the mark on their rifles. "Been waiting for this since we left the plantation," Abram said, running his thumb over the carved cross. "We fight for the Union tomorrow," Josiah reminded them. "Our fight comes later." Eli nodded. "But this is practice." Isaiah studied his rifle, feeling its weight. He thought of Ruth, hoping she was safe. He thought of the whip on his back, and Edward Beauregard's sneer. Then he looked at his brothers, these men who'd carried him through swamps and fever. "Whatever happens," Isaiah said, "we stay together." The other 5 nodded solemnly. Moses held up his rifle, the cross on its stock visible in the firelight. "The Carters of the Cross," he said, and the others echoed him, their voices quiet but firm. Around them, the camp buzzed with nervous energy. Men checked and rechecked their equipment. Officers called out final instructions. The air hummed with the promise of battle, of blood and glory and death waiting just beyond the horizon. But in that moment, around their small fire, the brothers found a strange peace. They had a purpose now. They had rifles in their hands instead of chains on their ankles, and they had each other. Dawn broke with a distant rumble that Isaiah first mistook for thunder. The sky turned from purple to pink as the brothers formed ranks with their regiment. The dew-soaked grass beneath their boots would soon be wet with something else. "Fix bayonets!" The order traveled down the line. Isaiah's hands fumbled with the long blade. Caleb helped him secure it, their fingers brushing briefly. "Stay close," Josiah whispered from his position. "Watch each other's backs." Across the field, gray uniformed figures emerged from the morning mist like ghosts. There were so many of them, far more than the Union line. "Steady, men!" shouted Captain Monroe, pacing behind the formation. "Remember your training!" Isaiah's throat went dry. Training was loading and firing at straw targets. This was men with guns who wanted to kill him. The first Confederate volley tore through the air. Men dropped around them. The noise was deafening. Not just gunfire, but screams, orders shouted, and the horrible wet sounds of bullets finding flesh. "Fire!" came the command. Isaiah pulled his trigger. His shoulder absorbed the kick. Smoke billowed across the field, hiding the enemy for precious seconds. Reload! His fingers, slick with sweat, worked the ramrod. Pour powder, pack ball, prime pan. He'd done this hundreds of times in drills. Now it meant living or dying. The Confederates charged through the smoke. Their rebel yell cut through the chaos, a sound that would haunt Isaiah's dreams for years to come. "Hold the line!" Josiah shouted, his voice somehow carrying over the din. "Stand firm!" Isaiah had never seen such violence. Men fell everywhere. Blood sprayed in fine mists when bullets hit. The brothers stayed together, reloading and firing in turn, so they were never all empty at once. Moses fired, dropped to one knee to reload while Eli fired over him. Abram and Caleb did the same. Josiah and Isaiah completed the rotation. It was like a dance they'd practiced all their lives, not just for days. "They're breaking through!" someone shouted as Confederates reached the Union line. Then the fighting changed. No more loading and firing in formation. Men grappled hand to hand, desperate and savage. A bearded Confederate lunged at Josiah with a bayonet. Josiah sidestepped, thrust his own blade forward. Isaiah watched the steel sink into the man's stomach. Josiah's face showed nothing as he twisted the bayonet, pulled it free, and moved to the next threat. Moses fought like a man possessed. When his bayonet snapped off in a Confederate soldier's chest, he swung his rifle like a club, crushing a man's skull with the stock. Blood and brain matter splattered his uniform, but Moses didn't flinch. "Isaiah, behind you!" Abram shouted. Isaiah turned to see a Confederate soldier raising his rifle. Without thinking, Isaiah parried with his bayonet, the blades meeting with a metallic screech. The man was older, with a gray-streaked beard. His strength pushed Isaiah back, step by step. "Die, boy!" the Confederate snarled, his face twisted with hate. Isaiah felt his boots slip in the mud. His arms burned from the strain. The man's bayonet inched closer to his throat. Suddenly, the pressure vanished. The Confederate stumbled backward, blood blooming on his chest where Caleb's bayonet had found him from behind. "We promised to watch each other's backs," Caleb said, yanking his blade free. The fighting surged around them like a storm. Isaiah lost track of time. He stabbed and shot and reloaded again and again until his movements became mechanical. Then, through a break in the smoke, Isaiah saw a young Confederate soldier, no older than himself, crawling away. The boy's leg was shattered, dragging uselessly behind him. When he saw Isaiah, his eyes went wide with terror. "Please," the boy begged, raising his hands. "Please, I don't want to die." Isaiah hesitated, his rifle half raised. The boy's face blurred in his vision, becoming Edward Beauregard, then returning to the wounded soldier. A shot rang out. The boy's head snapped back, a red hole appearing between his eyes. Isaiah turned to see Josiah lowering his smoking rifle. "He would have shot you tomorrow if you let him live today," Josiah said simply, before turning to face the next threat. The battle raged for hours. The line broke and reformed, pushed back, and surged forward. By midday, the Confederate attack faltered. Union reinforcements arrived, and the tide turned. When the smoke finally cleared, the field was littered with bodies in blue and gray. The brothers stood together, miraculously all alive, though not unharmed. Abram had a bullet graze across his shoulder. Caleb's face was slashed by a bayonet, a cut that would become another scar. All of them were covered in blood, some their own, most belonging to others. Captain Monroe strode through the ranks, his uniform torn and dirty, but his posture still rigid with pride. "Carter brothers," he called out, stopping before them. "Your valor today was extraordinary, standing firm when others faltered. The colonel himself witnessed your actions." Other soldiers gathered around, patting them on the back, calling them heroes. Isaiah stood in silent shock, unable to comprehend the praise for what they'd done for killing. "We ain't heroes," Josiah replied flatly, his face expressionless beneath the splattered blood. "We're men who survived another day." The captain looked taken aback, then nodded slowly. "Yes, well, rest while you can. We move out tomorrow." As night fell, the brothers sat around a small fire apart from the others. No one spoke. No one ate the hardtack and salt pork they'd been issued. They just stared into the flames, occasionally glancing at the stars as if searching for answers. Isaiah looked down at his hands resting on his knees. They trembled, not with the fear he'd felt that morning, but with something deeper. His mind replayed the young Confederate's pleading eyes, the sound of Josiah's rifle, the casual way his brother had turned away afterward. The trembling wasn't from terror or exhaustion. It was understanding what freedom truly cost, not just in running away or stealing rifles, but in blood, in becoming the very thing they hated, men who could take life without hesitation. Isaiah flexed his fingers, trying to still them. He'd expected to feel shame or horror after killing. Instead, he felt hollow, as if something had been scooped out of him and replaced with cold, hard purpose. Across the fire, Josiah caught his eye. His oldest brother gave him a single slow nod, recognition of what Isaiah now understood. Freedom had a price, and they were paying it one bullet, one bayonet thrust, one death at a time. The woods around Vicksburg buzzed with cicadas as evening settled in. 3 weeks had passed since Milliken's Bend, and the Carter brothers had survived 2 more skirmishes. Their regiment camped in a clearing surrounded by tall pines, the air heavy with summer heat and gunpowder. Josiah cleaned his rifle, while Moses whittled a piece of wood into a small figure. Isaiah wrote in a journal he'd found in an abandoned farmhouse. Eli read from a tattered Bible. Caleb mended a tear in Abram's coat. "Carter brothers." Captain Monroe approached their fire. "Need 3 men for night patrol along the supply road. Confederate scouts been spotted." "We'll go," Josiah said, without consulting the others. He nodded to Moses and Caleb. Back by morning. The 3 brothers disappeared into the darkness, rifles in hand. They knew these woods now. 3 weeks of fighting had taught them to move like shadows, to listen for the snap of twigs that meant danger. Hours passed. Isaiah dozed against a log while Eli kept watch. Abram sorted through their meager supplies, hardtack, dried beef, and coffee beans they'd been saving for a special day. Just before dawn, they heard the soft whistle, 3 notes, rising then falling, that signaled the brothers' return. But something was different. Josiah's face looked harder than usual. Moses clutched a leather satchel against his chest. Caleb's eyes darted around the camp as if expecting trouble. "What happened?" Eli asked, lowering his Bible. Moses tossed the satchel onto the ground. Papers spilled out. Folded letters, military orders, and a small leather-bound book. "Confederate courier," he explained, his voice low. "Riding alone." "Stupid man." Isaiah sat up straight. "You killed him?" "He's breathing," Caleb said. "Just won't be riding anywhere soon." Josiah knelt beside the papers, sorting through them quickly. Most were routine military communications, troop movements, supply requests. Then his hands stopped on one letter, sealed with red wax stamped with a familiar mark, the Beauregard cross. "Look," he whispered. The brothers gathered closer. Josiah broke the seal and unfolded the paper. Even in the dim firelight, they recognized the handwriting, neat, precise strokes that had once signed orders for their whippings. "It's addressed to Mrs. Eleanor Beauregard," Josiah said, his voice flat. "From our master." A heavy silence fell over the group. Isaiah's breath caught in his throat. It felt impossible that paper could connect them to that place, to that man, after all this time. "Read it," Moses demanded, his fists clenching. Josiah cleared his throat and began, "My dearest Eleanor, I write to you from our new home near Natchez, which I have named Beauregard's Promise. The house is not as grand as our Louisiana estate, but it will suffice until this unfortunate war concludes. The 20 acres I purchased from Colonel Jameson came with suitable quarters for our new stock, 15 souls in total, young and strong enough for good work. You will be pleased to know I have already established order. One troublesome male required correction yesterday, but the lesson was effective. The others now understand my expectations. Our neighbors include several families from Virginia who share our commitment to preserving our way of life, regardless of Lincoln's proclamations. We are confident that even if the war does not end in our favor, our arrangements here will continue undisturbed. I often think of those 6 ungrateful Carter boys who escaped during the chaos. I hear rumors of slave regiments to the north, and I wonder if they met their end on some battlefield. If so, it was a fate too merciful for their crimes. Send word when you are ready to travel south. The roads are dangerous, but I will arrange armed escort from Baton Rouge. Your devoted husband, Silas Beauregard. Josiah folded the letter slowly. No one spoke. The campfire crackled, sending sparks up toward the lightening sky. He's building it all again, Isaiah finally whispered, like nothing changed. Moses spat into the fire. New stock, he repeated, the words burning in his mouth. That's what we were to him. That's what these people are now. Eli closed his Bible. The Lord says vengeance is his alone. The Lord gave us these hands, Moses countered, holding up his calloused palms. And these rifles. Maybe that's his vengeance. Abram, who rarely spoke, looked up. Ruth might be there. He always favored her. The thought hung in the air like smoke. Their sister, left behind during their escape, might now be at this new plantation. Natchez, Caleb said, testing the word. 3 days hard riding south. Josiah stood up slowly. We took an oath, under the blood moon, to be free men, yes, but also to end his reign. We're soldiers now, Isaiah reminded them. Desertion means hanging if we're caught. After the next battle, Josiah decided. The major says we're moving on Vicksburg soon. Once it falls, we slip away in the confusion. Head south. Eli shook his head. This path leads to darkness, brothers. We'll lose our souls before we find peace. Josiah looked at him, eyes reflecting the dying fire. Then let peace find us later. One by one, the brothers nodded. Even Eli, after a long moment of silent prayer, gave his consent. It's decided then, Josiah said. We finish what started that night in Louisiana. They sat in silence as the sky lightened. Birds began to call in the trees around them. Soon the camp would stir with morning activity. Roll call, breakfast, drills. They would play their parts as dutiful soldiers of the Union for a while longer. Before the first bugle call, Josiah took the letter and carefully placed it under the ashes of their fire, burying it deep where no one would find it. Next time we march south, he said, watching the last corner of the paper blacken and curl. We march home. The brothers stood together as dawn broke over the trees. They were changed men now, soldiers who had seen death and dealt it, men who understood that freedom wasn't just about breaking chains. It was about making sure those chains could never be forged again. For Silas Beauregard, the war might end one way or another. But for the Carter brothers, it would end only one way, with justice served by their own hands. The swamps outside Natchez breathed like a living thing. Humid air clung to the brothers' skin as they crouched in the tall grass, studying the land before them. After 3 weeks of hard travel, avoiding patrols, sleeping in ditches, and eating whatever they could find, they had finally reached their destination. Morning mist curled around cypress knees and hanging moss. Through the haze, a thin spiral of smoke rose from a chimney. Beauregard's new kingdom. Beauregard's promise, Josiah muttered, the name bitter on his tongue. More like Beauregard's hell. Isaiah wiped sweat from his forehead. The plantation was smaller than their old home in Louisiana, a white two-story house surrounded by 20 acres of cleared fields. Behind it stood a row of rough wooden cabins. Men, women, and children already moved between the rows of cotton, overseen by men with whips and rifles. 15 souls, Eli whispered, remembering the letter. 15 people who should be free. Moses checked his rifle for the third time. Not for long. Caleb pointed to the edge of the property. Look there. Those trees would hide us until we're ready. Abram nodded. We wait for dawn. When they ring the bell for morning work, the brothers retreated deeper into the swamp to prepare. Each man cleaned his rifle in silence. They had abandoned their blue uniforms weeks ago, trading them for plain clothes that wouldn't draw attention. Only their weapons remained from their time as soldiers. That, and the hard look in their eyes that came from seeing too much death. Josiah drew a rough map in the dirt with a stick. Moses and Caleb take the overseer house. Abram and I will free those in the field. Eli and Isaiah checked the big house for Ruth, or any others kept inside. The night passed slowly. They took turns keeping watch, unable to fully rest with vengeance so close at hand. Isaiah traced the cross carved into his rifle stock, wondering if Ruth was truly there, if she'd recognize her little brother now. When the eastern sky began to lighten, Josiah woke them all with a touch on the shoulder. No words were needed. They moved through the swamp like shadows, rifles ready. The morning bell rang across the fields. Doors opened in the slave cabins as people emerged, heads down, shoulders slumped. 2 overseers stood near the edge of the fields, passing a flask between them. Josiah nodded once. 2 shots cracked the dawn silence. The overseers fell without a sound. For a moment, no one moved. Then chaos erupted. The enslaved people scattered, some running for the woods, others freezing in confusion. A white man appeared on the porch of the main house, shotgun in hand. Moses dropped him with a single shot. "Go!" Josiah shouted, breaking cover. The brothers rushed forward, firing at anyone who tried to stop them. Eli and Isaiah ran toward the big house, ducking low. They reached the porch steps as screams and gunfire filled the air behind them. "Check upstairs," Eli told Isaiah. "I'll look down here." Isaiah took the stairs 2 at a time, rifle ready. The house was finer inside than he expected. Polished wood floors, velvet curtains, paintings on the walls. Room after room stood empty until he reached the end of the hall. A woman sat by the window, her back to him, braiding her hair. "Ruth?" Isaiah's voice cracked. She turned slowly. Her face was thinner than he remembered, her eyes deeper. But it was her. Their sister, alive. "Isaiah?" She stood, trembling. "My God, is it really you?" He lowered his rifle, stepping toward her. "We came back for you, all of us. We're setting everyone free." Ruth moved to embrace him, but stopped suddenly. Her eyes widened, looking past Isaiah's shoulder. "How touching," came a cold voice. Isaiah spun around. Silas Beauregard stood in the doorway, revolver aimed at Ruth's chest. He looked older, his face more lined, but his eyes held the same cruel authority Isaiah remembered from childhood. "My property returns," Beauregard said with a thin smile. "All 6 of you, I presume. Coming to murder me in my bed?" Isaiah raised his rifle. "We're not your property. Never again." Beauregard laughed, a hollow sound. "You always were the stupid one, boy. Even now, playing soldier." He moved further into the room, keeping Ruth between them. "I heard about you, Carter boys. Killing white men, burning farms. Did you think I wouldn't be ready?" From outside came more gunfire. Shouts, the sound of breaking glass. "Your brothers are discovering my men are better armed than they expected," Beauregard said. He grabbed Ruth's arm, pulling her against him. "Now, what shall I do with you?" Isaiah's hands shook on his rifle. "Let her go." "Go on," Beauregard sneered, pressing the revolver against Ruth's temple. "Finish your war. Make her watch what animals you've become." Ruth's eyes locked with Isaiah's. "It's all right," she whispered. "I'm already free inside." Something in Isaiah snapped. His finger squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against his shoulder. The sound was deafening in the small room. Ruth jerked forward. Red bloomed across her chest like a terrible flower. "No!" Isaiah screamed. Beauregard, untouched, shoved Ruth's falling body toward Isaiah. In the confusion, he darted through the doorway and down the hall. Isaiah caught Ruth as she collapsed. Her blood soaked into his shirt. "No, no, Ruth, I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" "Isaiah?" Eli appeared in the doorway, his face going pale at the sight before him. "What happened?" "Beauregard," Isaiah choked out. "He used her as a shield. I shot her, Eli. I shot our sister." Ruth's breathing came in short gasps. "Brothers," she whispered. "You came back." Eli knelt beside them, pressing his hand against her wound. "Hold on, Ruth. We'll get help." But her eyes were already growing distant. "Sing for me," she asked. "Like we used to." Outside, the plantation was burning. Smoke filtered through the windows as Isaiah began to hum, "Swing low, sweet chariot," his voice breaking on every note. Ruth's lips curved into a faint smile. Her hand found Isaiah's and squeezed once, before going limp. The brothers carried her body out as flames consumed the house behind them. They found the others in the yard, Josiah bleeding from a shoulder wound, Moses and Caleb supporting Abram, who limped badly. "Beauregard?" Josiah asked, his face hardening at the sight of Ruth. "Gone," Isaiah whispered, "into the swamp." Around them, the plantation burned. The freed people had vanished into the surrounding woods. Bodies of overseers lay scattered across the grounds. Morning light filtered through Spanish moss as the brothers sat in silence around the fresh-turned earth. They had buried Ruth beneath a towering oak tree at the edge of the property, far enough from the burned plantation that the smoke wouldn't touch her. The grave was simple, a mound of dirt with a wooden cross at its head. Caleb worked his knife carefully, carving Ruth's name into the crossbeam. "Ruth Carter," it read. Nothing more was needed. Isaiah hadn't spoken since the shooting. He sat with his back against the oak, eyes fixed on nothing, his sister's blood still staining his shirt. The others moved around him carefully, like he might break at any moment. "She's with the angels now," Eli said softly, kneeling beside the grave. He placed Ruth's small wooden crucifix atop the dirt. "Free, at last." "Free?" Moses spat the word. "She died in chains while that monster ran free." Josiah stood with his arm in a makeshift sling, his gunshot wound poorly bandaged but no longer bleeding. "And he'll die in chains, too. We finish this." Caleb looked up from his carving. "Beauregard will head home, back to what he knows, the old plantation." Abram nodded, leaning on a stick to keep weight off his injured leg. "Near the bayou." "Then that's where we go," Josiah said, his voice flat and final. Isaiah finally stirred. "I killed her." His words hung in the heavy air. "No, brother." Eli squeezed his shoulder. "Beauregard killed her, the same as he killed countless others with his whip and his greed." "My bullet? My hand?" Isaiah's eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. "I can still feel the trigger." Moses crouched in front of him. "Then use that feeling. Remember it when we find him." They gathered what little they had: rifles, ammunition taken from the overseers, a few days' worth of food. Caleb finished the cross and planted it firmly at the head of Ruth's grave. Each brother touched the wooden marker before turning away. "We move northwest," Josiah said. "Stay off the main roads. 5 days' journey if we're careful." The brothers set out as the sun climbed higher, leaving behind the smoking ruins of Beauregard's second failed kingdom. They walked in silence, through cypress groves and fields gone wild without tending. The war had emptied much of the countryside, farms abandoned, roads patrolled by nervous soldiers from both sides. They slept that night in a thicket of brambles, taking turns keeping watch. The next morning, they continued north, following the river when they could, keeping to cover when they couldn't. On the third day, rain poured from leaden skies. They took shelter in an abandoned slave cabin, its roof mostly intact, though its occupants long gone. As lightning flashed outside, tension finally broke between them. "This won't bring Ruth back," Eli said, staring into the small fire they'd built in the hearth. "Nothing will," Josiah answered, "but it will end what started when we were born into his chains." "End it how?" Eli pressed. "With more killing? More blood?" "Yes," Moses said flatly. "His blood." Caleb, who rarely spoke, looked up from whittling a small wooden figure. "What happens after? When he's dead?" The question hung in the air. None of them had thought beyond vengeance. "We keep living," Josiah finally said. "Find land somewhere far from here. Build something that's ours." Isaiah spoke for the first time that day. "Can we? After everything we've done?" "We didn't choose this fight," Abram reminded him. "It was forced on us from the day we were born." "But we choose how it ends," Eli insisted. "Beauregard took enough. Don't let him take your soul, too." Moses stood abruptly. "My soul?" He laughed, a harsh sound. "What's left of it?" "I've killed more men than I can count. We all have. There's always a path back to grace," Eli said quietly. "I don't want grace," Moses replied. "I want justice." "And what's the difference?" Caleb asked, still working the wood in his hands. No one answered. The rain continued through the night. They moved on at first light, more careful now as they entered lands they once knew. By the fifth day, familiar landmarks began to appear. A twisted oak tree where they'd once hidden from the overseer, a bend in the river where they'd fished as boys. The sun was setting when they reached the clearing where Beauregard's mansion had once stood. Now only blackened timbers remained, jutting from the ground like broken teeth. The gardens were overgrown, the fields returning to wilderness. Nature was already reclaiming what man had built. They crouched at the edge of the trees, scanning the ruins. Nothing moved among the charred remains of the house. "There," Caleb whispered, pointing. The barn still stood at the far edge of the property, damaged but not destroyed. A faint glow flickered through its weathered boards. A lantern. "Someone's inside," Josiah said. "Beauregard," Moses growled. "Who else would come here?" They checked their rifles one last time. The sky darkened around them, stars beginning to appear overhead. Josiah's face was a mask of stone as he studied the barn. "How do we do this?" Abram asked. "Together," Josiah replied. "The way we've done everything since we ran." Isaiah's hands trembled on his rifle. "What if I can't pull the trigger?" "Then I will," Moses said. Eli touched Isaiah's arm. "Do what your heart tells you is right." They moved forward as one, 6 shadows crossing the open ground between the trees and the barn. No dogs barked to announce them. No guards appeared to challenge them. Only the wind moved, rustling through the tall grass that had once been manicured lawn. As they reached the barn door, Josiah raised his rifle with his good arm. His eyes reflected the lantern light from within as he whispered, "It ends tonight." The full moon hung overhead like a silent witness as the brothers fanned out around the weathered barn. Its silver light caught on their rifle barrels and painted their faces in ghostly pallor. The smell of rotting hay and old manure mixed with the lingering scent of ash from the burnt plantation house. Through gaps in the wooden planks, a feeble lantern light flickered. From inside came the unmistakable sound of a man's voice. Raspy, desperate words tumbling over each other in what might have been prayer. Between phrases, wet, hacking coughs echoed in the empty space. "That's him," Moses whispered, his knuckles white around his rifle. "I'd know that voice anywhere." Josiah signaled them to hold position. He stepped forward alone, his injured arm still in its crude sling. From his belt, he pulled something that gleamed dully in the moonlight, the overseer's whip they'd taken from the new plantation. The leather was worn smooth from years of use against human flesh, their blood. Josiah ran his fingers along it once, his face unreadable. "Remember what he did with this," he said quietly to his brothers. "Remember the scars we all carry." Caleb nodded silently, his gentle eyes hardening at the sight of the weapon. Isaiah trembled, but stood his ground. Eli murmured something that might have been a prayer of his own. Abram and Moses flanked the barn door, rifles ready. Inside, Beauregard's coughing grew more violent. "Lord, spare me," they heard him gasp between fits. "Your faithful servant." Josiah stepped to the barn door and pushed it open with his boot. It creaked on rusted hinges, swinging wide to reveal the interior. Silas Beauregard huddled in the corner on a makeshift bed of moldy straw. His once fine clothes were filthy and torn. His face, once flushed with power and bourbon, was gaunt and gray. A single lantern cast his shadow large against the wall. His eyes widened in terror when he saw Josiah standing in the doorway. "No," Beauregard whispered. "God, no." Without a word, Josiah tossed the whip across the dirt floor. It landed with a soft thud at Beauregard's feet. "You want to live?" Josiah's voice was steady, almost gentle. "Earn it." Beauregard looked from the whip to Josiah, confusion wrestling with fear on his ravaged face. "What do you mean? Show me how brave you are without your overseers, without your dogs, without your guns." Josiah stepped further into the barn. "Show me what kind of man you truly are." Understanding dawned in Beauregard's eyes. With shaking hands, he grabbed the whip and struggled to his feet. He swayed there a moment, a shadow of the tyrant who had once ruled their lives. "You can't do this," he said, voice breaking. "I owned you." "Not anymore," Josiah replied. The first lash came hesitantly, the whip barely uncoiling before striking across Josiah's chest. He didn't flinch, didn't blink. His eyes remained fixed on Beauregard's face. Beauregard's second strike came harder, fueled by desperation. The whip cracked against Josiah's shoulder, tearing his shirt. A thin line of blood appeared, but still, Josiah stood unmoved. "Is that all?" he asked quietly. With a cry of rage and terror, Beauregard drew back for a third strike, putting all his remaining strength behind it. The whip whistled through the air, but this time it went wide, catching the lantern hanging from a beam. Glass shattered. Oil spilled. Fire erupted instantly, climbing the dry wooden walls with hungry orange fingers. The flames caught the ancient hay scattered across the floor, spreading in a rush of heat and light. Beauregard screamed, dropping the whip and scrambling backward. Smoke filled the barn in thick, choking clouds. The brothers outside shouted, but their voices seemed distant through the roar of the blaze. Josiah, momentarily stunned by the sudden inferno, breathed in a lungful of smoke and collapsed to his knees. The fire had already blocked the doorway, cutting off his escape. "Josiah!" Caleb's voice pierced through the chaos. Without hesitation, he rushed through the curtain of flames into the burning barn. Inside, he found Josiah struggling to stand in the thickening smoke. Caleb grabbed him with both hands, pulling him toward the door. Behind them, Beauregard's screams grew more frantic as fire consumed the corner where he was trapped. They were almost at the door when a fiery beam crashed down from above. Caleb shoved Josiah forward with all his strength, but couldn't pull his right hand away in time. The burning timber pinned it to the ground with a sickening crack. Caleb's scream joined the roar of the fire. Moses and Abram rushed forward, dragging both brothers clear as more of the roof began to collapse. They stumbled away from the barn just as its structure gave way completely, sending a fountain of sparks into the night sky. The five brothers fell to the ground several yards away, gasping for clean air. Eli tore strips from his shirt to wrap around Caleb's crushed and burned hand. The injury was severe. Bones visibly shattered, skin blackened. Inside the collapsed barn, Beauregard's screams had stopped. Only the crackling of flames remained. For a long while, none of them spoke. They sat or lay on the cool ground, watching as fire consumed the last standing structure of the plantation. Sparks drifted upward like fireflies, disappearing into the night. The moon continued its silent journey across the sky. Isaiah, face streaked with soot and tears, finally broke the silence. "Is it over?" Josiah, still catching his breath, looked at each of his brothers, at Moses's hard face, at Eli's troubled eyes, at Abram's exhaustion, at Caleb's pain as he cradled his ruined hand. "No man owns us now," he said quietly. The flames reflected in their eyes as they watched their past burn away, shoulder to shoulder in the night. The first pale light of dawn crept across the riverbank, touching the 5 brothers with gentle fingers. They sat huddled together, their bodies heavy with exhaustion. Soot marked their faces like war paint, and dried blood stained their tattered Union uniforms. The muddy Mississippi rolled past, indifferent to their suffering, carrying debris from battles upstream. Caleb sat with his back against a cypress tree, his face tight with pain. His right hand, what remained of it, lay wrapped in strips of linen torn from Eli's shirt. The once white fabric had turned red-brown with blood and yellow with pus. "Let me fix this," Eli said softly, kneeling beside him. He unwrapped the crude bandage carefully, revealing the crushed and burned flesh beneath. The smell made Isaiah turn away. Caleb didn't flinch, just watched with dull eyes as his brother cleaned the wound with river water and bound it tighter with fresh cloth. "I'll still live," Caleb said, his voice raspy from smoke. "You'll do more than live," Eli replied, tying the final knot. "You'll make things again. Just different things." Josiah stared at the water, silent as he had been since they'd left the burning barn behind. The barn where Beauregard had died screaming. His shirt hung open, revealing the fresh whip marks across his chest. Moses caught fish with a sharpened stick, while Abram gathered wild berries from bushes along the shore. They worked without speaking, moving like ghosts in the growing light. "We need to move north," Josiah finally said, his voice startling them all. "Follow the river until we find friendly lines." No one argued. When the sun climbed higher, they gathered their few belongings and began walking. Caleb leaned on Isaiah, his good hand gripping the boy's shoulder. The path beside the river was muddy and thick with reeds, but it kept them hidden from any patrols that might pass. Days blurred together. They ate fish cooked on small, smokeless fires. They slept in shifts, 2 always watching while the others rested. They spoke little, each brother lost in his own thoughts, his own nightmares. On the 4th day, Caleb's fever broke. His hand would never work again, but the infection had retreated. "God's mercy!" Eli called it. Josiah said nothing, but his shoulders seemed to relax slightly. On the 7th day, they heard voices ahead. Men speaking English with northern accents. They froze, looking to Josiah for direction. "We can't run forever," he said quietly. "Let's see if they're friends." They approached slowly, hands raised to show they were unarmed. A Union patrol of 8 men surrounded them quickly, rifles aimed. "Halt! Identify yourselves!" ordered their officer, a young lieutenant with a neat mustache and suspicious eyes. "What unit? Where are your papers?" The brothers stood silent for a moment. Their stolen uniforms were filthy and torn beyond recognition. Their rifles were gone, lost during their flight from the plantation. "We're men who finished their war," Josiah said simply. The lieutenant studied them, noting Caleb's bandaged arm, their exhausted faces, the burn marks and wounds. Understanding slowly replaced suspicion in his eyes. "Deserters?" he asked quietly. "Survivors," Josiah corrected. The officer nodded slowly. "You look half dead." We've got food and a medic back at camp." He hesitated, then added, "Whatever you did, whatever you were running from, it's over now." President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. "You're free men by law now." Eli laughed suddenly. A strange, hollow sound. "By law," he repeated. The patrol shared their rations and dressed Caleb's wound properly. They provided information about Union positions and safe routes toward Baton Rouge, where colored regiments were being resupplied. "You could rejoin there," the lieutenant suggested. "The war's not over yet." Josiah shook his head. "For us, it is." That night, the brothers made camp one last time by the river. Tomorrow they would part ways with the Union patrol and head east toward new lands. The fire burned low between them, casting long shadows across their faces. Isaiah pulled out a small book, bound in leather, a journal he had taken from the lieutenant when the man wasn't looking. From his pocket, he produced a small ink pot and a pen. "What are you doing?" Moses asked. "Writing it all down," Isaiah replied. "Everything that happened, so we don't forget." He mixed ashes from the fire into the ink, making it darker, thicker. The scratching of his pen filled the silence as he worked, his young face serious with concentration. "Ruth taught you good," Abram said softly. It was the first time any of them had spoken her name since they buried her. "She did," Isaiah agreed, not looking up from the page. Each brother stared into the flames, seeing different things. Moses saw the Confederate soldiers he had killed at Milliken's Bend. Eli saw the preacher who had offered safety, but not dignity. Abram saw Edward Beauregard's face as the dogs turned on him. Caleb looked at his ruined hand and saw all the things he would never carve again. Josiah saw nothing but the fire itself, burning away the past, burning away the pain, leaving only the brothers themselves. One by one, they drifted into sleep, exhaustion finally claiming them. Only Isaiah remained awake, writing by firelight until his eyes grew heavy. He closed the journal and looked around at his brothers. Caleb's bandaged arm rested across his chest. Eli's lips moved in silent prayer, even in sleep. Moses and Abram lay back to back, protecting each other even now. Josiah sat propped against a tree, finally at rest, his face peaceful for the first time in years. The fire died to embers. Above them, stars began to fade as the eastern sky lightened. Isaiah looked toward the horizon where, miles away, smoke from Beauregard's plantation still drifted faintly upward, a distant smudge against the dawn. He didn't need to see it to know it was there. Some fires burn long after the flames go out. "We were slaves once," Isaiah whispered to the sleeping forms of his brothers. "Now we are something the world can't name, men who walked through hell and came out holding each other." The river flowed on beside them, carrying their story forward into a future none of them could yet imagine. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.